Let's talk about everyone's favourite apothecary. Clone Lord, Spider, Reddit atheist, feminist icon, Fabius Bile has an almost endless list of titles and nicknames, and is definitely among the most entertaining and interesting characters in the setting. Despite being a Chaos Space Marine, from arguably the most corrupted of the original traitor legions, Fabius Bile here still clings firmly to the imperial truth of the Great Crusade, refusing to believe in the sentience of the Chaos Gods despite the literal mountains of evidence staring him in his geriatric face, including the fact that he himself has birthed a minor Chaos God. Before we get into the video, I do just want to quickly thank my channel members: Vort, Cersei, Victory Kaiser, Kraydog, Jewish Dictionary, Tootsie Cat Meow, Nicholas, Imondo, and SP Keating, that's a lot of people, wow, for supporting me, as well as ask you, if you haven't already, to like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment. It really does help smaller channels like mine more than you probably expect. Anyway, on with the video. Born into nobility on Terra, probably somewhere in Bavaria, Fabius developed an interest in flesh crafting as a child, spurred on by one of his family's servants. His most successful experiment was modifying mice to duel one another while dressed as 14th century noblemen. We've all been there, you know how it is. You will also know that it is very hard to convince mice to use swords, rather than their teeth and claws, as Fabius found out to his dismay. His creepy little servant referred to the mice reverting to their base instincts as the beast flesh always coming back, as no matter how much you alter something's flesh, you cannot change its soul. Very profound. Thank you, Mr. Nameless Servant. Fortunately for young Fabius, he was saved from his unsuccessful experiments by recruitment into the 3rd Legion of Space Marines, known as the Emperor's Children, where he very quickly rose to become an apothecary, basically a Space Marine combat medic / scientist combo. Unfortunately, he was recruited into the Legion shortly after a Selenite attack on the Legion's gene seed. Any warrior implanted with the corrupted gene seed essentially developed super cancer, which became known as the gene-blight. Because of the Legion's hard-on for perfection, any infected Astartes would be executed, partly in an effort to stop the spread of the disease, and partly to provide Fabius and the other Legion apothecaries with genetic material to aid research. Eventually, Fabius discovered that he himself had become infected, but due to his, quite frankly, massive ego, decided that he was far too important to die, and switched his samples with one of his battle brothers, condemning that poor guy to death instead. Fabius had hoped to find a cure before the rediscovery of Fulgrim on Chemos, though this was not to be, and he would instead be among the mere 200 warriors remaining to meet their dad, who would personally save his legion by allowing his genetic material to be harvested in order to create new, uncorrupted gene seed. Despite new recruits not suffering from the blight, there was still no saving those Marines already suffering from it, the only one of whom is relevant right now being Fabius. He might be the only named character to have ever had it, actually. Either way, Fabius continued his search for a cure, and managed to hold off the effects of the blight in himself by constantly hot-swapping his organs with clones, though each time a new organ was implanted, it would soon become infected. After Fulgrim took command of his legion, I made a video a while ago talking about the history of the Emperor's Children as a whole if you want to read more into that, not much changed for Fabius Bile over here, though he did become the chief apothecary of the Legion somewhere around this time. Following the incident on the planet of Laren, where Fulgrim found this wonderful and not at all cursed sword, Bile noted that many among the snake monsters that lived on the planet had improved themselves with various genetic and chemical modifications, a discovery that would become something of an obsession within the apothecary. Partly because of the demon sword that his daddy had picked up, and partly because of how insecure Fulgrim was even before falling to chaos, Bile managed to convince his Primarch that he could improve the gene seed of the 3rd Legion, and further their quest for perfection. I'm actually not sure whether Bile had been corrupted by chaos by this point, experiment, as his vibes were decidedly off even when he was a loyalist, so it is possible that he genuinely was trying to improve his legion for the good of the Imperium. Even if that were true, though, it probably didn't matter to the Blood Angels wounded during the War on Murder, who Bile kidnapped and subjected to horrific experimentation in his quest for improvement. Incidentally, it was these experiments that led to the first Noise Marines, or Cacophony, which is a very fun name, such as Eidolon and Kaiseron, who were personally created by Fabius, though over the years more and more Noise Marines were created by others. They weren't all made by Bile. As Chief Apothecary of the 3rd Legion, and premier mad scientist amongst the traitors as a whole, Bile was held in high regard by Horus following the outbreak of the galaxy-spanning conflict known as the Horus heresy. In fact, the War Master ordered either Alfarius or Omegon to give Fabius the superpowered gene seed that they stole from the Raven Guard, though for reasons known only to the Alpha Legion, the data had been sabotaged, meaning that any research into it would be a drain on manpower and resources, and would not provide any benefit to the traitors. Following the demands of Fulgrim, Fabius began experimenting with making clones of the Primarchs, creating multiple replicas of Ferrous Manor, all of whom Fulgrim attempted to convert to the traitor cause, and all of whom refused before promptly being killed. Somewhere around this time, Fabius, and a few of his friends, engaged in a light bit of CBT with their Primarch, in an effort to drive out the demon that may or may not have been possessing him at the time. The Reflection Cracked was a weird book. He also brought a few members of the Legion back from the dead, including Eidolon and Lucius, notably the first time Lucius was resurrected. Anyway, moving past that, Bile took part in the Siege of Terra along with the rest of his legion. Unlike the other traitor legions, however, who were mainly focused on, winning the war, the Third were more interested in amusing themselves by torturing the planet's general population. Bile took the opportunity to experiment on the captives, grinding them up to create special drugs to heighten the pleasure of the legionaries. Despite his involvement, the siege furthered Bile's disdain for his legion, who he viewed as ungrateful and self-absorbed hedonites, which does certainly feel rather hypocritical. He was disgusted by the warp powers unleashed by the other traitors, and by their hatred of the Emperor, who he viewed as an amazing scientist following similar pursuits as himself, the truth of which is debatable, and decided to leave the siege before the death of Horus. Fulgrim was not best pleased by this when he found out, and put a sizable bounty on the Chief Apothecary's head. In the aftermath of the siege, Bile was pursued by the Salamander's Legion, including by Vulcan himself. He was kind of a big deal, I don't know if you've noticed. Bile was finally caught in the Arden system, where he was apparently serving an arsewife character. Regardless, Fabius's experiments upon Arden 9 were destroyed by the righteous fire of every Eldar child's worst nightmare, and Fabius himself was forced to flee into the Eye of Terror, where eventually he landed on a Crone World. Crone Worlds are the old homeworlds of the Eldari Empire, which were consumed by the birth of Slaanesh, and are also where they get all their spirit stones. This particular one was called Urum, and became the base of operations for Fabius until pretty much the current day of the setting. Following Fulgrim's retreat to the Orgy planet after the siege, Fabius emerged as one of the most powerful figures in what was left of the Legion, who elected him as Lieutenant Commander in the absence of their daddy, in what was a surprisingly democratic move for the Third, concluding that the best way to save each of the traitor legions was to clone every Primarch and personally raise them as atheists. Rogue move, I know, but I never claimed he was sane. Bile set up a laboratory in Canticle City, the fortress of the Emperor's children on the demon world of Harmony. Fabius successfully captured the corpse of Horus from the world of Malium, with the aim of cloning him to provide a unifying figure for the disparate legions, and ending the legion wars within the Eye of Terror. However, Abaddon and his newly formed Black Legion launched a surprise attack on Canticle City, killing Horus and the other cloned Primarchs, most most of whom were deformed monstrosities reminiscent of Dead Space enemies, and forcing Bile to flee with what little of his research he could salvage. Ultimately, Bile concluded that the Primarchs were too strong-willed to be influenced by him, and as such, any attempts at cloning them and raising them had been doomed from the start. The clones also didn't possess the soul/warp fuckery that the original Primarchs did, and were basically just big space marines, which was why Abaddon could win that 1v1 with the clone of Horus. But the ins and outs of cloning in 40k are a topic for another time, I think. He also decided that the 3rd Legion, and in fact all of the traitor legions, had fallen too far to be saved, and decided to focus on other projects. Most notably the New Men, a race of modified humans that Bile believed would inherit the galaxy, replacing both regular humans as well as space marines. In the following centuries, Bile travelled the galaxy, offering his services to various planetary lords or rebel leaders in return for the flesh tithe, which was just prisoners, or ancient knowledge, and seeding his creations on many imperial planets. Despite the fact that he is obviously evil, and at least a little bit chaos corrupted, Bile still clings to the old imperial truth, believing that only the foolish and weak seek the comfort of gods. He eventually ended up forming the Consortium on Urim, a collection of apothecaries from various legions and chapters that all seek to learn from the old chief apothecary. One of those apothecaries, Oleander Coe, allied with a band of harlequins led by Salandri Veilwalker in an attempt to manipulate Fabius into returning to lead the Emperor's children once more, resulting in a large-scale attack on the Eldar craftworld of Lugganath, which allowed Bile to harvest Wraithbone, though he ultimately refused to return to the Legion. Bile would use the Wraithbone he harvested from Lugganath as a way to transplant his memories into cloned bodies, thus allowing him to sidestep the worst effects of the gene-blight by body hopping whenever it got too bad, though each subsequent body breaks down faster than the last, so eventually he is going to have to figure something else out. Sometime later, Bile was captured by Flavius Alcanex and taken to Harmony to stand before Eidolon, who asked the apothecary to retrieve a lost gene seed tithe of the Emperor's children that had gone missing in the days before the gene-blight. While exploring the ruins of his former lab on the Demon World, Bile discovered that one of his clones of Fulgrim still lived, was notably not a mutated monstrosity, and could be used alongside the lost gene tithe to recreate an uncorrupted version of the 3rd Legion. Unfortunately for Fabius, but fortunately for anyone who likes museum curators, the gene tithe had been nicked by Trazyn the Infinite, who at first attempted to add the chief apothecary to his collection, but ultimately was content with securing Bile's help to attempt to capture the Salandri and the Harlequins instead. Upon their return to Bile's ship, the Vesalius, they discovered that Alcanex had attempted to seize control of the vessel, though the Fulgrim clone, now matured, had rallied the new men aboard to resist him. Disturbed by the loyalty of his creations to the clone, as well as by the clone acting like an individual, rather than only doing what Bile told him to do, the apothecary exchanged the clone, as well as Alcanex and the Emperor's children aboard his ship, to Trazyn in return for the lost gene tithe, enough to produce nearly 18,000 legionaries. Fabius sought to further his research by travelling to Komara, managing to enter the Drukhari city by capturing a warship, before allowing himself to be captured by the Homunculi Covens, who, luckily, were impressed and agreed to tutor him, rather than torture him. Once he felt he had learned all he could from the Dark Eldar, and notably after he had created the Tower of Flesh, which is exactly what it sounds like, for the homunculus coven of the 13 Scars, Bile instigated a civil war within Komara, using the Chaos as cover to escape, but angering the 13 Scars in the process. This would later turn out to be a mistake, as when the Coven began to move against him in a coordinated campaign, his entire race of new men came under threat, as they had captured Oleander from earlier and used him to tell them where each of Fabius's laboratories were hidden. Bile ultimately chose to bend the knee to Fulgrim and therefore Slaanesh, pledging his soul in exchange for securing their aid against the Eldar. Though, to be fair to Fabius, he did make sure to stipulate that his new men would be allowed to choose their own future, rather than and becoming slaves to the Dark Prince. This whole Dark Eldar situation came to a head at the Battle of Belial 4 in M37, where the 13 Scars were defeated. As a result of his wounds, however, Fabius effectively died, being placed in a bio-casket within the webway until he could later be revived. Despite this setback, Bile continued to operate in the form of a Gestalt consciousness of a dozen or so fully autonomous clones for the next few millennia. Yeah, we're getting into the weird part of the Fabius Bile lore. This is also where I should mention that the fervent worship of him as a god by his many creations across the galaxy, including the New Men, meant that Fabius was gradually giving rise to a minor chaos god known as the Pater Mutatis, whose growth was further fueled by the Wraithbone technology that Fabius had used to create the clones of himself. After the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum towards the end of M41, the casket containing the primary Fabius was found and opened by the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler. Now reawoken and reinvigorated from a 3,000 or 4,000 year long nap, Fabius I was intrigued to learn of Belisarius Cawl and his Primaris Marines, and though he considers them lesser than his own New Men, he seeks to use the genetic template that created them in order to create something even greater. To that end, Bile was able to invade Cawl's flagship, the Tsar Kaistor, overpower Alpha Primus, the original Primaris Marine if you couldn't guess from the name, and steal his progenoid glands before fleeing. While he hasn't succeeded in creating anything substantial from this acquisition, at least that we know of, Bile did reappear during the Pariah Crusade, where he raided the homeworld of the Gilded Suns chapter of Space Marines, looting a large amount of their gene seed before escaping. For those keeping count, that means that Bile is in possession of a significant chunk of all the gene seed currently within the galaxy. So that was Fabius Bile, the Clone Lord, his origins, history, and current antics. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much, it really does mean a lot. Like, subscribe, all the rest. A huge thank you again to my wonderful channel members, and I will see you all in the next video.